Okay, let's dive right into an explainer that tackles the elephant in the room regarding a highly misunderstood topic, permaculture. Today, we're going to confront its massive identity crisis head-on. If you've spent any time at all looking into regenerative agriculture, you've definitely heard the term. But you've also likely bumped into a really confusing blend of genuine ecological science mixed with, frankly, some highly questionable dogma. So we're going to peel back the layers today and separate the actual science from the woo-woo. You know, this quote from author Toby Hemingway captures the problem perfectly. When a genuinely potent method of food production gets tangled up in totally unrelated, unverified belief systems, people naturally walk away. The movement tends to paint with this contradiction-laden brush, and unfortunately it turns away the exact scientific minds that it desperately needs.
So, it begs a really crucial question for us. What actually happens when legitimate science gets hijacked? In this explainer, we're going to figure out how a highly productive agricultural framework ended up stereotyped as a cult, and more importantly, how we can sift through the noise to find the rigorous, data-driven science underneath.
Let's just ground ourselves in the basics for a second. Permaculture absolutely did not start as a mystical belief system. Coined back in the 1970s by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren as a mashup of permanent agriculture, it was explicitly meant to be an evidence-based regenerative practice. The whole idea is to model human settlements on the self-sustaining, resilient patterns we already see in natural ecosystems. At its core, it's a rational design science, not some chaotic organic gardening hobby.
All right, let's jump into part one, the dichotomy between cult and smart permaculture.
There is just a stark divide here. On one side, we have what we'll call cult permaculture. This relies heavily on an uncritical reverence for founding texts, personal anecdotes, and mythical beliefs. But on the flip side is smart permaculture, which is grounded in academic rigor, peer-reviewed agroecology, systems theory, thermodynamic efficiency, and hard empirical metrics. This is the version that actually aligns with real ecological engineering. Now, you might be wondering, how did this split even happen? Well, historically, Bill Mollison deliberately kept permaculture out of traditional academia because he wanted it to remain a grassroots movement, accessible to absolutely everyone. But ironically, this lack of scientific gatekeeping just left the door wide open. It allowed unverified practices and pseudoscientific approaches to completely flourish without any peer review to keep them in check. Moving right along to part two, myth-busting the companion planting dogma. We've all seen those gorgeous watercolor-style charts floating around the internet claiming certain plants are best friends and absolutely must be planted together. But think about it. Do they really share nutrients just by sitting next to each other? We're going to look at what the actual science of agroecology has to say rather than just relying on those copy-pasted lists. We literally have to let go of this dogmatic idea of dynamic accumulators. The myth goes that certain deep-rooted plants pull nutrients from way down in the subsoil, bring them to the surface, and magically share them with the surrounding plants. The truth? As our source material points out, an early author basically admitted to making this entire concept up. It totally lacks robust scientific proof, yet it's still treated as absolute gospel in a lot of cult permaculture circles. The ecological reality is far more pragmatic. Look, plants aren't stupid. They live in a fiercely competitive environment. They're not just freely donating their hard-earned nutrients to their neighbors out of the goodness of their hearts, simply because you decided to plant them side by side. The idea that plants act like a charity for other living plants just doesn't align with how biology works. Okay, part three. Let's bust another massive myth, the nitrogen-fixing reality.
There is this massive misconception in the grassroots permaculture community that legumes basically act like constant fertilizer sprinklers for the rest of your garden. But the real question is, do they actually release this nitrogen into the surrounding soil while they're actively living and growing?
Let's be crystal clear about this. Nitrogen fixing only works when the plant is harmed or killed. All that great nitrogen is locked up tightly in root nodules. For it to become available to your other plants, those nodules have to break down, and that requires mechanical disturbance, severe pruning, or the actual death of the plant itself. They are absolutely not just giving away free nitrogen while they're alive and thriving.
So here's what the actual verifiable science looks like in action. First, you plant your legume, like vetch, and the bacteria form a symbiosis in the roots. But step 3 is the crucial one. It requires your active management. You have to use a technique like chop and drop, where you heavily prune or cut the plant back. This forces the root die-off, which then finally releases the nitrogen. It's not magic, guys. It's a measurable biological process that requires deliberate intervention. Which brings us to part 4, Smart permaculture as a rational, ecological design science.
When you strip away all that pseudo-spirituality, what you're left with are some incredibly powerful tools. Smart permaculture is a highly effective design science. We're talking about utilizing hydrological engineering, like mapping out swales to capture thousands of gallons of rainwater runoff, and focusing on closing waste loops and maximizing natural energy capture through scientifically validated multifunctional polycultures.
And the math behind why this works is just brilliant. When you analyze land equivalent ratios, or LER, peer-reviewed meta-analyses show that an integrated polyculture, like a maize and bean intercrop, consistently hits an LER of 1.2 to 1.5. To put that into perspective, it means that by integrating these plants correctly, where the beans fix nitrogen for next year and the corn supports the beans, you are producing 20 to 50% more total output from the exact same amount of land compared to a standard segregated monoculture.
60%. That is a staggering number. It represents the reduction in pesticide applications documented in a 2021 study when researchers shifted from monoculture controls to an integrated polyculture. Natural pest predation just took over, and the need for chemical intervention absolutely plummeted. It's definitive proof that functional diversity in design actually works.
The foundational rule of smart permaculture is observation over dogma. Literally, the very first principle is to observe and interact. That means you have to act like an empirical scientist. You spend weeks using tools like site mapping, studying water flow, and analyzing climate adaptation for your specific landscape before you plant a single thing. You don't just blindly follow some guru's generalized planting list.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Part 5, a grounded, sustainable future.
True permaculture is held together by three very real ethics: earth care, people care, and fair share. It operates on 12 flexible design principles, not rigid cultish rules. It demands that we value empirical metrics, that we humbly accept feedback loops when our systems fail, and that we design from large ecological patterns all the way down to the details. This is exactly how we step away from chaotic hobby gardening and start building resilient, zero-waste agricultural systems.
Ultimately, what we're talking about here is a massive paradigm shift. We are trying to move upstream from a mechanical worldview, one that relies on heavy inputs and generates tons of unused waste, to a truly ecological worldview. By embracing the scientific paradigm, we can create highly productive human landscapes that have the diversity, the stability, and the resilience of natural ecosystems, fostering genuine self-reliance. So, I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. Are we going to embrace the rigorous, data-backed science of ecological design, or are we going to remain distracted by the unverified dogma of the garden cult? Honestly, that choice dictates the entire future of sustainable agriculture. I challenge you to look at your own backyard or farm not as a canvas for untested myths, but as a living, breathing laboratory for rational, regenerative science.